Rain hammered the mountains as the Special Operations Team raced to escape enemy territory. Among them was 18-year-old Scout Emily Carter, bleeding from a gunshot wound and barely conscious. When the commander ordered the retreat, nobody argued. Leaving her behind was the only way to survive. As the convoy disappeared into the storm, Emily lay alone in the mud, abandoned by the people she trusted most. Then something impossible happened. A strange ringing filled her ears. Moments later, she heard voices, not nearby, not across the valley. Enemy soldiers were approaching from 2 miles away, and they had no idea she could hear them. Emily Carter had joined the Mountain Reconnaissance Unit at 17, the youngest recruit in the outfit's 20-year history. She had not arrived with connections or commendations or a family name that opened doors in the quiet ways that family names sometimes do in institutions built on hierarchy and tradition. She had arrived with a hand-drawn map of a ridgeline pass that 3 senior scouts had declared impassable, and she had walked it alone the previous summer, barefoot in places where her boots had given out, counting her steps in the dark with the methodical patience of someone who had long ago learned to make do with what she had and trust the results. Captain Marcus Webb had looked at that map for a long time before he signed her transfer papers. He had not looked at her face while he did it. That was fine. Emily had never needed anyone to look at her face. She needed them to trust the map. She needed the work to speak in a register that did not require youth or gender to be factored out of the equation before anyone would listen. Over the following year, she had given them reason after reason to do exactly that. She had located a hidden artillery position tucked behind a limestone formation that aerial reconnaissance had missed entirely, the kind of miss that happens when the people looking at photographs from altitude are looking for what they expect to find rather than what is actually there. She had tracked a supply convoy through 3 consecutive nights of fog, using sound patterns alone, noting the rhythm of different engine types, the interval between gear changes on the steep grades, the way sound bent around particular rock formations in ways that could be calculated and cross-referenced against her topographic surveys. Her reports were meticulous, her instincts almost uncanny, and her commanding officers had begun to rely on her work while simultaneously finding reasons not to include her name in the formal citations that followed each successful operation. She was young. She was female. She had a way of being quietly right that made certain men deeply uncomfortable, the way an accurate clock makes people uncomfortable when they have been telling themselves it is earlier than it is. So Emily Carter gathered her intelligence, filed her reports, and did not complain. She understood that the work was the work, regardless of who received credit for it. The mission to the border highlands had been assigned on a Tuesday, with the brisk efficiency that characterized all such assignments, the operational order arriving in a manila folder with a cover sheet and a timeline and the particular density of information that meant someone had done their homework before sending people into the mountains. The intelligence suggested an enemy communications relay station operating from a disused mining complex near the summit of a ridge called Harrow Peak. Emily's unit was tasked with confirming the relay's location, documenting its activity, and withdrawing without contact. A clean surveillance operation. She had done 12 of them and understood their particular rhythms and requirements. This one was supposed to be no different. The team moved into position on Thursday, navigating a route Emily had scouted and marked across a series of exposed ridges where the wind came off the higher elevations in gusts that tasted of ice and altitude. By Friday morning, they had confirmed the relay's location and captured 11 minutes of signal traffic on a recorder that the signals specialist, Corporal Huang, had duct-taped to the inside of his pack in a manner that suggested both professionalism and a personal relationship with improvisation. The withdrawal began at 1400 hours. The storm arrived at 1422. It came from the northwest with no warning and no apology, driving rain so thick it reduced visibility to arm's length and turned the rocky paths into running streams that had not existed 30 minutes before. The unit moved faster. Too fast. Someone missed a marker on the descent. Someone else followed the wrong someone. By the time Captain Webb called a halt, they were 300 meters off course and descending a slope that Emily recognized immediately as the wrong one, the one that led into the narrow gully with the collapsed stone walls and the sightlines that favored anyone positioned above. She said so. She said it clearly and without urgency, the way she said things she was certain of, because urgency without accuracy was worse than no warning at all. Webb told her to keep moving and worry less about being right and more about being fast. she kept moving. She noted, as she moved, that the footing on this slope was worse than on the correct route, and that the drainage patterns she had mapped from satellite imagery showed standing water likely in the lower gully during heavy precipitation events. She did not say this. She had already said what mattered. She moved and watched the terrain and counted the distance to the floor of the gully below. The ambush had been waiting for them at the bottom. The enemy unit was small, 6 soldiers positioned behind a collapsed stone wall, but they had the elevation and the element of surprise, and those 2 advantages were worth more than numbers in the narrow gully where the first shots rang out with a cracking precision that told Emily someone had pre-positioned very carefully and waited very patiently. She had been moving to the left flank, trying to create an angle that would allow the team to break contact and climb back the way they had come. When the round caught her in the right side just below the ribs, she went down into the mud with the abrupt completeness of a switch being thrown, her body registering the impact before her mind had finished processing what had happened, and she lay there for a moment that felt architectural in its completeness, like a room she had suddenly found herself standing in without knowing how she had entered. She heard the firefight continue around her. She heard Webb shouting orders with the focused authority of a man whose training had superseded whatever fear he felt. She heard boots on wet rock, the specific sound of people moving fast with weapons. She heard the particular silence that follows when people have run far enough that their footsteps no longer carry, even in conditions that usually amplify sound. She tried to stand. Her body considered the request with what felt like genuine reluctance and declined. The rain came down and the blood came out in a warmth that contrasted with the cold air and the cold mud in a way that her mind registered with the dissociated clarity of shock, and Emily Carter lay in the bottom of a gully in the border highlands and listened to the sound of her unit moving away. She heard Webb's voice one more time, distant and cutting through the rain with that quality of command that she had always respected even when she had disagreed with the commands themselves. He was telling them they had no choice. He was telling them the mission parameters were clear. He was telling them what she already knew, which was that a single wounded scout could not be extracted under these conditions without compromising the entire team and the signal intelligence they were carrying. She knew all of this. She had read the same field doctrine they had all read. The doctrine was correct. The decision was correct. The feeling it produced was something the doctrine did not address. A particular variety of cold that had nothing to do with temperature, and she let herself feel it for exactly as long as it took the last vehicle engine to fade completely into the distance, and then she set it aside, because there was nothing useful it could tell her. Emily Carter closed her eyes in the mud and breathed. One breath, then another. Then she began the process of deciding what to do next. The ringing started in her left ear first. She thought it was blood loss. She thought it was the particular kind of auditory hallucination that came with shock, the way the brain generates noise when the body is overwhelmed and beginning to conduct its internal negotiations between function and surrender. She had read about this phenomenon in a field medicine manual she had memorized during her first winter in the unit, the one Lieutenant Garza had lent her without comment after she had asked him 3 times whether there were any books in the supply depot that were not about vehicle maintenance. The ringing was perfectly pitched, a clean tone at a frequency she could not quite name, and it did not behave the way she expected hallucinations to behave. It did not waver or pulse or dissolve at the edges. It did not dissolve into other sounds. It simply existed with the clean insistence of a tuning fork struck against a stone, and then it began to expand outward from the point where it had started, as though the ringing were a door opening rather than a sound arriving. Emily pressed her hand against the wound in her side and focused on breathing, and did not move and listened to the ringing become something else entirely. It was as though a dial were being turned very slowly, tuning through layers of static she had not known were there, and the static was resolving into texture. The texture was resolving into layers. The layers were separating into individual components, each with mass and direction and distance, each occupying a distinct position in a spatial map that her mind was assembling with the same methodical precision she brought to the paper maps she drew by hand. She heard the rain on rock surfaces 200 meters to her east, distinct from the rain on soil directly above her head, the difference in surface density producing a different acoustic signature that she had never consciously noticed before and now could not ignore. She heard water running in a drainage channel she had marked on her survey map as dry during the pre-mission reconnaissance. She heard the mountain breathe in the particular way. Mountains breathe when they are absorbing weather, the deep settling of water into stone, the adjustment of load in loose talus, the creak of timber where a scattered stand of pine marked a sheltered hollow to the north, and then, beneath all of it, threading beneath the rain and the wind and the settling of wet rock, she heard voices. They were not close. Some part of her mind that was still performing calculations confirmed this immediately and without drama, cross-referencing volume against clarity against the acoustic properties of the gully and the ridge above it and the intervening terrain she had mapped and walked. The voices were not across the valley. They were beyond the valley. They were moving through terrain she could place precisely on her mental map, and the placement put them at a distance she could not rationally accept. She heard the crackle of a field radio and the particular squelch break pattern of a two-way communication protocol she recognized from equipment she had studied in the signals intelligence module of her advanced reconnaissance training. She heard the words distinctly, in a language she had spent 2 years studying until she could read its newspapers and follow its radio broadcasts and think in its grammatical structures during long watches when her mind needed something to do. She understood the words with a completeness that was different from the ordinary completeness of comprehension. She understood them the way she understood terrain from a well-made map, with the layers visible simultaneously and the relationships between them clear. 2 soldiers were discussing their orders. They had been told that the valley was clear following the contact that had driven out the foreign reconnaissance unit. They were to make a sweep anyway, standard procedure, moving along the east wall of the ridge and descending through the gully. The gully where Emily was lying. She heard the time marker they were given for the sweep's completion. She heard the route they were assigned, which she traced in her memory against her own survey work with the ease of someone checking a calculation against a known result. She heard the name of the sergeant who had given them their orders, a name she filed away with the mechanical efficiency that had always been her strongest professional asset, the capacity to commission and retain it without distortion regardless of the circumstances in which it arrived. Then she heard something that drove every other consideration from her mind entirely, cleanly, and completely, the way a loud sound drives away a quiet one. One of the soldiers was laughing about the sweep. It was a waste of time, he said, because the valley was clear, and besides, by tomorrow night none of it would matter anyway, because the big operation would be underway by then, and the forward base at Miller's Crossing would be in ruins, before anyone on the other side had time to understand what was happening. His companion told him to be quiet. He laughed again and was quiet. Emily lay in the mud with her hand pressed against her wound and her heart hammering in the measured way that hearts hammer when they are working hard and the body around them is making important decisions, and she understood with absolute clarity that she was not hallucinating and she was not dying. She was, instead, waking up. She waited 6 minutes before she moved. She counted them against the voices. She could still hear them, fainter now but traceable, moving along the route she had anticipated they would take. She waited until the direction of their sound shifted enough to confirm they had turned south at the junction she had mentally marked as their most likely waypoint. Then she moved. Moving was expensive in a way that transcended the ordinary physical vocabulary of effort and pain. Her body charged her for every inch of movement in a currency she could not afford to spend freely, but she paid anyway because the only alternative was to remain still, and the voices had told her that remaining still beyond the minimum necessary was a choice with consequences she was not willing to accept. She worked her way north along the gully floor using her elbows and her left side and the low-profile crawling technique from the close-terrain survival module, the one the instructor had run them through 6 times in a muddy field until everyone could do it in the dark. She found the drainage channel she had heard in the first moments of her expanded hearing and followed it upstream to where it disappeared beneath an overhang of granite that the satellite imagery had shown as a shadow without explaining what cast it. The space behind the overhang was barely large enough to hold her if she pulled her knees up and kept her head down. She pulled herself into it and lay there in the relative dryness while the rain continued outside and her hearing continued to do things that no field manual she had read provided any framework for explaining. She stripped off her outer jacket with the careful economy of someone who cannot afford to use their right side fully, and tore it into lengths, and packed the wound with compression she had practiced on a training dummy in a brightly lit classroom and had never expected to practice on her own body in the dark beneath a rock in a rainstorm. It was not sufficient in any ideal sense of the word. It was the best she had. She worked methodically, tying the improvised dressing as tightly as she could manage with her available hand and her teeth, and the patience that had always been her most fundamental characteristic, and while she worked, she listened to the mountain and everything on it and beyond it that her new and unexplained capability chose to present to her. She heard the sweep team complete their circuit and report back on the radio, their voices precise and clear in the acoustic architecture of her awareness. Despite the distance her internal calculations continued to insist they maintain, she heard the sergeant's acknowledgement and the handoff to a second team beginning a wider perimeter search. And she heard, threading through all of it, persistent as a signal on a clean frequency, the ongoing planning conversation for an operation that was going to kill a great many people if no one warned them. The attack was scheduled for 0300 hours the following morning. She heard this confirmed 3 separate times in 3 separate conversations among personnel who believed themselves unobserved, each confirmation adding detail to the intelligence picture she was assembling with the same systematic care she applied to every piece of information she had ever gathered in the field. She heard the route of approach, along the eastern drainage, through the secondary access road, using darkness and the assumption of surprise. She heard the designation of the unit involved, which she cross-indexed against the order of battle knowledge she carried in the part of her memory reserved for operational context. She heard the names of 2 officers coordinating the operation at the command level. She heard the stated objective: neutralize the forward command element and destroy communications infrastructure. Miller's Crossing would be silent by morning if no one warned them. Emily checked her watch. 16:47. She had approximately 10 hours, accounting for the margins of error that attended any intelligence estimate produced from a drainage gully by a wounded 18-year-old without a functioning radio. She had a radio. She needed to look at it more carefully than she had so far. The radio on her belt had taken a round through the battery housing during the contact in the gully. The casing was cracked along 2 planes and the indicator light was dark, and the antenna had been bent at an angle that suggested something interior had experienced a catastrophic mechanical shift. She held it in the diminishing light under the granite overhang and studied it with the focused attention she brought to every problem that mattered and several that did not, because she had found that the habit of attention was not selective without cost. She had read the technical manual for this model during a long post-duty a year ago, working her way through the circuit diagrams and component descriptions with the same patience she brought to terrain maps, on the principle that understanding how things worked was always worth the time it required. She knew what was inside the housing, and she knew which components were likely to have survived the impact, and she knew, with the particular quality of reluctant optimism that had characterized her approach to difficult situations since childhood, that there was a chance. She used the edge of her knife to pry the cracked casing apart with the delicacy the situation required. She worked by touch as the light faded, building a tactile map of the device's interior that corresponded to the diagram she was holding in memory. The battery had split along one cell junction bridgeable, if she could create the connection with what she had available. She used a length of wire from the radio's own antenna circuit, stripped with her knife and bent into contact across the damaged junction, and held it in place with a strip of adhesive from the medical kit she carried in her breast pocket. The transceiver module, when she tested it with a careful short pulse, responded. She had 1 transmission, possibly 2 if she was exceptionally conservative with her keying time. She composed what she needed to say in her mind with the precision of someone who understood that every word counted, and that the ones she chose would be measured against the consequences of the information they carried. The radio came alive with a burst of static that she killed immediately by adjusting the squelch. The signal was weak and declining. She keyed the handset and put out a call on the unit's emergency frequency without preamble, because preamble was a luxury the battery could not afford. The voice that answered was Sergeant Delgado from the Operations Center at Miller's Crossing, a man she identified from the particular way he acknowledged incoming transmissions, a habit of double-clicking the transmit button before speaking that she had noted on a dozen previous communications as a small personal signature that the protocol books did not require. She gave him her identifier. She gave him her position, accurate to the 200-meter grid square she was confident in given her navigation to the overhang. She gave him the attack timeline, the route of approach, the objective, and the unit designation. She gave him the names of the 2 coordinating officers. She gave him everything she had gathered in the hours since the ringing began, sequenced in the order of operational priority rather than the order in which she had received it, because she had thought about this sequencing in advance and knew how information should be delivered when time was uncertain. When she finished, the silence on the other end lasted long enough to make her question the connection. Then Delgado's voice came back, and in it she heard something she had half expected, the particular tonal quality of a man who is doing the math on what he has just heard, and finding that the arithmetic produces a result he cannot comfortably accept. He asked her to repeat her identifier. She repeated it. He asked her to confirm her medical status. She confirmed it accurately. Because accuracy was a professional habit she did not abandon for the convenience of appearing more functional than she was. He told her to stand by, and she heard him, in the background of the open channel, tell someone in the room that the signal was from the Carter Scout, the one they had lost contact with at Harrow, and that she sounded like she might be in poor condition. She heard the skepticism in his voice and did not resent it. Skepticism was the correct professional response to intelligence delivered from an improbable source under improbable circumstances. She had always respected correct responses, even when they were directed at her. The operations officer who came on the line 12 minutes later was Major Lena Hartwell, whose voice Emily had heard in the Friday briefing, and whose questions during that briefing had been the most technically precise of anyone present. Hartwell conducted herself with the careful formality of someone who understood that the situation required precision rather than warmth, and Emily appreciated this. She walked through the intelligence again at Hartwell's request, the same information in the same sequence, and answered the follow-up questions with the same directness she had applied to the initial transmission. She heard Hartwell consulting with someone whose voice she did not recognize, a rapid exchange in low tones that her extended hearing resolved into clarity without effort. The unknown voice said the unit designation Emily had provided matched a formation that signals intelligence had been tracking for 6 weeks, moving in patterns consistent with preparation for a large offensive action, and that the route of approach Emily had described aligned precisely with 2 separate terrain analyses conducted by the base's own planning staff. The silence after this exchange was different from the silence before it, more attentive, more costly, carrying the weight of people revising their probability estimates in real time. Hartwell came back on the line and told Emily to maintain her position and that a search and rescue element would be dispatched as soon as conditions permitted extraction. Emily acknowledged and did not say what she was thinking, which was that conditions might not permit anything before 0300 and that the question of her extraction was secondary to the question of what Miller's Crossing intended to do with the next several hours. She had done what she could do. The battery bridge gave out 7 minutes after she signed off, and the radio died with the finality of something that had given everything it had, and Emily placed it carefully beside her in the darkness under the granite overhang and listened to the mountain and waited. At 0217, she heard the attack organize itself 2 miles away, the particular sounds of a military unit preparing to move in darkness, the muffled check of equipment, the brief low-voiced communications of soldiers confirming their positions and their understanding of the plan, the rhythm of men adjusting to each other's presence and readiness in the way that units do when the thing they have been preparing for is finally about to happen. She heard it with the complete clarity of her new capability and filed each element against her understanding of the plan, confirming that what was organizing itself out there in the dark matched what she had reported with sufficient fidelity to leave her with no further uncertainty about the accuracy of her intelligence. And at 0240, she heard the first response from Miller's Crossing. The positioning of defensive elements, the establishment of interlocking fields of fire, the controlled and methodical preparation of a base that had been warned, and had used its warning with the professionalism she would have expected from the personnel she had worked alongside. The contact, when it came at 0304, was fierce and brief and decisive in the way that firefights become decisive when one side has given up surprise and the other has used its preparation well. She heard it all not as noise and chaos and the terrifying randomness of combat, but as a structured event with identifiable phases and clear outcomes. The attacking force lost its momentum in the first 90 seconds when its lead element encountered a defensive position where it had expected empty space. It lost its coherence in the following 3 minutes when coordinated fire from 2 prepared positions disrupted its command structure in a manner that the unit's planning had not accounted for. It withdrew at 0312, and the withdrawal was not orderly, and Emily lay under her granite overhang and listened to it dissolve into the dark and allowed herself, for the first time in many hours, to exhale fully. 163 personnel had been at Miller's Crossing that night, plus the signals detachment, plus the civilian contractors who ran the maintenance facility. She had spoken with Delgado about this in the weeks that followed. When she was well enough to have the conversation, he had confirmed the number, 163. She held the number carefully, the way you hold things that have weight, and set it down in the part of her mind where she kept the things that mattered most. The search element found her at 0720. She was conscious, barely. Her improvised dressing, having held better than the medic who treated her on site would have predicted from the materials available. Corporal Finch, the medic, was a deliberate young man who wrote careful notes and asked careful questions. And when Emily told him, as he was preparing her for transport, that there was something else they needed to know, not the attack that was already reported, but the other conversation. The one she had heard before any of it. The one that explained how an ambush had been arranged with such precision for a route that had been held in strict operational security. He stopped what he was doing and listened. She gave him the names. 2 names, held clear in her memory through a long night of cold and pain, and the sustained effort of processing more sound than any person was designed to process. He wrote them down. One of the names was familiar to him from his own professional context, and she watched his face as he read what he had written, and understood from the particular quality of his stillness that she had been right about what the names would mean. He folded the paper and put it in his pocket and resumed his work. Emily let him work. She had said what needed to be said. She closed her eyes and let the mountain recede behind her as the transport carried her down through the breaking storm, and she did not try to hear anything else. She had heard enough for one night. She had heard, she suspected, enough to change a great many things. The investigation that followed the arrests of Torres and Okafor moved with the careful inevitability of something that has been waiting for an opening. Torres, once he understood the scope of the case against him and the arithmetic of cooperation, began to talk with the resigned thoroughness of a man who has decided that the best remaining option is to be useful. He identified the intermediary he had used to pass information, a civilian contractor named Gerald Marsh, who had worked the basis transportation network for 6 years, and whose access to logistical schedules had made him an ideal conduit for the kind of routing intelligence that had been feeding the enemy's operational planning. Marsh, when found, had physical records, kept in a manner that suggested either arrogance or an expectation that he would never be found, and the records were detailed enough to establish not just what had been passed and when, but who had been the source and who had been the recipient at each stage of the chain. From these records, the full picture began to emerge, not as a sudden revelation but as a gradual accumulation of connections, each one confirmed and cross-referenced before the next was pursued, building the architecture of a corruption network that had operated invisibly inside the daily routines of a military installation for 4 years. The network had not been careless. Its members had understood that the greatest risk to any covert operation is pattern, and they had worked deliberately to avoid it, varying the timing of their communications, using different intermediaries for different categories of information, never meeting in person when any other method was available. What they had not accounted for was that their avoidance of pattern was itself a pattern, visible to someone who knew how to read the spaces between events rather than the events themselves. Emily had begun to understand the network's shape during the long hours under the granite overhang, listening to conversations the participants believed to be private. She had heard more than the attack plan. She had heard, in the intervals between operational communications, the comfortable shorthand of people who have been working together for a long time and no longer feel the need to be careful about what they say. She had cataloged these fragments with precision, and by morning she had assembled from them a partial map of the network structure that she gave to Finch along with the names. The investigators told her, later, that the partial map had accelerated the investigation by weeks. She had noted this without comment. She had been doing her job. The period between her initial reports and Okafor's arrest had lasted 11 days, and during those 11 days she had not been entirely safe. She understood this the moment Finch's expression changed when he read the names. Okafor had access to base communications infrastructure. If he understood that she had survived and the attack's failure at Miller's Crossing would have told him that someone had transmitted a warning, and the source would not remain unknown for long, he would understand that she was a problem requiring resolution before the investigation could be formally opened. Emily had been moved 3 times during those 11 days, each relocation conducted with the operational security the case demanded. She had not been told the reason for the first relocation, but she had inferred it without difficulty and cooperated without requiring explanation. She spent the time in each temporary location doing what she always did, working. She wrote out everything she could remember from the night in the gully, organized by category and cross-referenced against the order of battle and terrain knowledge she carried in memory, producing a document of 37 pages that the investigators found useful in ways she had not fully anticipated. She had also, during those 11 days, continued to listen. The counterintelligence team had not asked her to do this. She had done it because the capability was present and the information was available, and the work of gathering it seemed more valuable than sitting in a relocated room waiting. She reported what she heard carefully, Noting the caveats she felt were honest, she could not always identify the precise source of a transmission she intercepted at distance, and she could not always be certain that acoustic conditions were producing accurate spatial information rather than distortions she could not account for. The team incorporated her reports with a combination of gratitude and the focused skepticism of people who wanted to be sure they were not building a case on foundations that would not hold. She respected the skepticism. She answered every question about her methods and her certainty with the same directness she brought to all professional communication. The foundations held. There was one moment during those 11 days that she did not include in any formal report, because it was not information but something more personal. She had heard Okafor's voice once, in the early hours of the 7th day, speaking in the low and careful register of a man who is afraid and is making plans he believes are still available to him. He had spoken about the scout who had been left at Harrow. He had spoken about her in a way that confirmed what she had already inferred, that she was the problem he needed to solve, and that he was trying to determine whether she could be reached before the investigation progressed beyond the point where solving her would still be useful. She listened to this with a stillness that would have looked like calm from the outside, but was in fact the particular quality of attention she brought to things that required complete understanding before she decided how to feel about them. She understood what she was hearing. She held it in her mind until she had examined it from every angle, and then she set it down in the part of her memory where she kept things that had happened and could not be changed, and she went back to work. 3 days later, Okafor was arrested. The formal investigation convened 10 days later, after Emily was stable and the intelligence had been cross-referenced and the names she had given Finch had been matched against financial records and communications logs and the security review findings that the names themselves had prompted. Randall Torres, signals technician, 11 years of unremarkable service that had been its own form of camouflage. Captain David Okafor, logistics officer, careful and senior and convinced, until the transcription was placed in front of him on the 3rd day of his interrogation, that there was no way the information could have reached anyone. He read the transcription with the attention of someone trying to find the error in a calculation that cannot be correct, and did not find the error, because there was none. He understood then what had happened. He asked for a lawyer. The case proceeded. What it found was larger than 2 men, a network running 4 years, cycling intelligence through intermediaries, surviving 11 prior reviews by being careful enough and patient enough and invisible enough in the way that corruption embedded in routine tends to become invisible. The unit at Harrow had been compromised before they left the wire. The ambush had been prepared for them specifically. Emily had been meant to die in that gully, and the storm had been a convenience that no one had anticipated needing, but everyone on the wrong side of the operation had been grateful for. When Major Hartwell presented the full findings to Emily in the quiet room that had become their standard meeting place, Emily sat with the information for a long moment before she spoke. She said it explained some things that had not quite fit. Hartwell asked which things. Emily told her precisely, and Hartwell wrote it down, and the investigation expanded one more time to cover the territory Emily had identified. The hearing itself had a quality she had not anticipated, not dramatic, exactly, but weighted in a way that made the ordinary procedural language feel heavier than it was designed to be. Military hearings are formal by nature and design, the formality serving as a container for things that are not formal at all, and this one was no different. Evidence was introduced with the careful staging of people who had assembled it over weeks and wanted it received in its proper sequence. Emily sat through the first 2 days as an observer, watching the architecture of the case being assembled piece by piece, finding it consistent with what she knew and noting, without satisfaction, where the connections she had provided had been the keystone that allowed other elements to be placed correctly. Her testimony on the 3rd day required the kind of care she reserved for things where the truth had more than one dimension. She was not generous in any sentimental sense. She was accurate. Webb had not known. She believed this and said it. And the basis for her belief was the same as the basis for everything she said. She had listened carefully and remembered accurately and reported what she had found rather than what she might have preferred to find. The board accepted her testimony in both matters and incorporated it into its findings. The findings were what they were. She did not have opinions about findings in the way that other people sometimes did. Findings were the result of a process applied to evidence. And if the process and the evidence were sound, the findings were what they should be. The hearing was formal and thorough and took 3 days. Emily attended in dress uniform with the same posture she always carried, straight, attentive, giving away nothing she had not decided to give. She testified twice, once for each dimension of the case, and said everything she had to say and nothing she did not. and when she was asked whether she believed Captain Webb had known about the compromise, she considered the question with genuine care before answering that based on what she had heard and observed, she did not believe he had, that his decision had been consistent with doctrine given the information available to him. She said it clearly, and heard Webb's long exhale across the room, and did not look at him because her testimony was not for him and its accuracy was not contingent on what he felt when he heard it. The convictions came 3 weeks later. The medal came 2 weeks after that. The general's speech was appropriate to the occasion and she received it appropriately and shook the hand that was offered. Afterward, in the corridor, Webb waited with his cap in his hands. He said she was a remarkable person. She said she was a scout. She said it the way people say things that are true and sufficient and require no elaboration. Then she went back inside because there were people she needed to talk to about her next assignment, and the work was the work, and it was waiting. The military researchers who came to evaluate her were professional and puzzled in equal measure. They ran every test their methodology could accommodate and produced papers they circulated among colleagues in disciplines not accustomed to being consulted on reconnaissance questions. Emily read the papers when they were shared with her and identified 2 methodological errors, which she noted in a brief memo to the lead researcher, who corrected them in the revised version without comment. Her unit received her back without ceremony. Kowalski shook her hand and held it a moment too long, which was his version of an apology. Huang brought coffee on her first morning back. Reyes worked beside her for 3 days in complete professional silence before stopping at the door of the map room and saying he was glad she was alive. She told him she was glad he had driven well enough to get the others out. That was the end of it, which was the correct ending. The mountains beyond the wire looked the same as they had always looked, layered and patient and indifferent to the particular dramas unfolding at their feet. Emily stood at the perimeter on her second evening back and listened to them. She heard wind through a rockfall 3 miles northeast. She heard water under ice in a seasonal stream she had mapped her first winter. She heard the quality of silence that exists between sounds when you have learned to separate sound from silence and understand what each is telling you. She had always been a person who listened carefully. The storm had simply removed the ceiling from what careful listening could achieve. She filed this in the part of her mind where she kept useful information and went back inside to finish her report. The work was the work. It had always been the work. The storm had changed many things, but it had not changed that. The weeks after the hearing had a different texture from everything that had preceded them, less urgent, more spacious, with the quality of time that follows large events once those events are resolved and life is reassembling itself around the space they once occupied. She ran through her rehabilitation exercises with the same consistency she brought to everything, monitoring her wound's progress with the detached interest of someone who has a professional relationship with their own body's functioning and knows better than to mistake restored function for completed recovery. She read everything the research team sent her. She thought about the capability in the way she thought about all tools, carefully, practically, without mysticism. It had a range. It had conditions that affected that range. It had limitations she was still in the process of identifying, because you cannot know the full limits of a thing until you have worked within them long enough to find the edges. She was working within them. She intended to keep working. This seemed like the appropriate response to possessing a capability that no existing framework fully explained. You did the work. You documented what you found. You remained honest about what you did not yet know, and everything else followed from those 3 things, or it did not follow at all. She drew maps of the approaches to the border highlands from memory during the evenings, checking her recall against the official surveys when she had access to them, finding her memory accurate to within the tolerances that satisfied her professional standards, and told her that the months of intensive survey work she had completed before Harrow had not been wasted, even when Harrow itself had nearly wasted her. She answered the research team's questions with the precision they deserved, and noted clearly where her certainty ended and her inference began, because the distinction mattered, and because she had never been in the business of telling people what they wanted to hear when accuracy was available at the same price. The researchers appreciated the distinction. Their papers noted it explicitly. Emily read the papers, found 2 methodological errors which she corrected in a brief memo, and considered the matter concluded. Her unit received her back without ceremony, which was how she preferred it. Kowalski shook her hand and held it a moment longer than a handshake required, which was his version of a sustained apology, and she accepted it as such. Huang brought coffee on her first morning back without being asked, which was his version, and she accepted that too. Reyes worked beside her for 3 days in complete professional silence. focused and competent and giving nothing away, before stopping at the door of the map room on the evening of the third day and saying, without looking at her directly, that he was glad she was alive. She told him she was glad he had driven well enough to get the others out, because she meant it and because it was true, and because the truth had always seemed to her like the most useful thing she could offer anyone. He looked at her for a moment, and something shifted in his expression, and he nodded and went away. And that was the end of it. It was the correct ending. Some things are resolved by what is said, and some by what is left unsaid, and this had been a combination of both, weighted toward the latter, which was appropriate for people who communicated primarily through the work they did beside each other. On her second morning back, before the rest of the base had fully come to life, she walked to the eastern perimeter and stood facing the mountains. The light was coming in at the low angle of early morning, catching the upper ridgelines and leaving the valleys in shadow, and the mountains had the particular look they had in this hour, austere and complete, and indifferent to the specifics of what had happened at their feet over the past weeks. She listened. She heard wind moving through a rockfall 3 miles northeast, the specific acoustic signature of loose talus in a crosswind that she had cataloged during her first year of working this terrain. She heard the seasonal stream she had mapped 2 winters ago, running under ice now with a muffled regularity she could track to within 10 meters of its source. She heard 2 vehicles on the base road, their engine types distinct, their speeds calculable from the interval between their sound's arrival and departure. She heard the mountain breathing in the particular way mountains breathe in the hours before the sun fully reaches them. She stood with all of it moving through her, the wind and the water and the cold engine sound and the vast geological patience of the ridge lines, and she let herself be a person for a moment before she went back inside to be a scout. One was not a departure from the other. They had always been the same thing. She had known this before Harrow, and she knew it more clearly now, and the knowing was worth what it had cost, even though the cost had been very high, and she would carry the physical evidence of it for the rest of her life in the scar below her ribs. She turned from the perimeter. She went inside. She sat down at her desk and opened the map she had been working on the day before the Harrow mission, and found her place on it without difficulty. She picked up her pencil. The storm was the night they abandoned her. The silence afterward was the moment they realized they had abandoned the one person who could hear what nobody else could.